Chapter 16. Second Date. The Double Deuce was quickly developing a reputation as a good place for good people looking for a good time. Dalton stood out front, underneath the newly erected canopy with its flashing neon sign, and looked down the queue of people waiting to come in. The line went along the velvet rope and was at least 50 feet in length, and 2 people deep, and new patrons were arriving in cars all the time. The voices he heard carried the tone of excitement, not the undercurrent of threat that used to be the standard out here. New uniforms had arrived for the staff, red polo t-shirts with Double Deuce embroidered in white on the left breast. Dalton was proud to see that the bouncers now looked like a team, as well as acted like one. At the outside door, Younger was using a clicker to count the customers in. As he headed inside, Dalton passed Jack, manning the inner door, now taking strong ownership of the area that Dalton had always intended for him. They smiled at each other as he passed. Dalton himself wasn't wearing the uniform. He wasn't working tonight, just watching. He had expected that would make him nervous, but as he looked up at the stage, at Cody playing Roadhouse blues, and at all the smiling faces in the club, he knew he wasn't needed. That gave him a sense of pride. The new bartender, Ernie, met him at the bar with a fresh cup of coffee. Leaded, of course. Dalton thanked him and took a sip of the bitter brew as he watched Tillman crossing the room. The proprietor was stopping at tables and schmoozing with the bar's patrons, asking them how their night was going and whether he could do anything for them. Finally feeling like the club owner he'd always wanted to be. Dalton had never seen him so happy, but he did catch a glint of concern in the boss's eyes as he approached the bar and said, "Ernie, what's the story?" "Whiskey's running low," the bartender answered. Tillman leaned back against the bar with a sigh of frustration. "I finally get this place just the way I want it, and now we're running out of booze." He chuckled uncomfortably at the machinations of fate. "I've called every supplier I know. Why won't they deliver?" "I think I know the answer to that," thought Dalton to himself. "Wesley," he said, then turned to the bar. "Ernie, give me the phone." Dalton had worked at another club, the Buckle, over in Springfield a few years back, and still knew some suppliers there. He thought he could remember their numbers. "I'll take care of it," he reassured Tillman, and began twisting the rotary dial. At the end of a long but peaceful night at the Double Deuce, Dalton headed out the main door, rubbing his eyes and ready for bed. Parked right out front, leaning on her red Jeep and, he hoped, waiting for him, was the Doc. He suddenly felt more awake. "Hi," she said, with that cute smile. Dalton smiled back, pleased to see her, and admiring the way she wore her white cotton dress. He walked over. "I hear you're the new marshal in town," she joked. "You heard wrong," Dalton replied modestly. "Where to?" she asked, dangling her keys in her hand. "I'll drive," he offered, looking her in the eye to see if that was all right. She handed over the keys. Dalton hadn't told her where they were headed, and they spent most of the drive in silence, both just enjoying the late-night cool air blowing through their hair. When they got to the end of the old country lane and pulled up at Emmett's place, she looked around for a moment. "This is your place?" she asked. Dalton nodded at the barn. "Up there," he said, and he could see that she was skeptical. He let her lead the way, into the barn and up the stairs, and was relieved by the pleasant look of surprise on her face when he turned on the lights. Still, he decided to explain what might seem, to some, an odd choice of home. "It's quiet, and the horses let me know if anybody comes around." She turned back to him with a look that said, "You don't need to explain anything to me." He liked that. "I love it," she said. She walked over to one of the windows and opened it wide. Across the river was Wesley's ranch house, and Dalton thought that seeing it seemed to give her pause for some reason. She didn't seem to want to talk about it, so he headed over to the radio. It was an old post-war style with a chrome dial on the front. He started turning it until he found a station. "I sold my soul to rock and roll," started jamming away. He looked at her and she looked at him, and together they shook their heads in unison. Not right. He tried again, passing by a few more rock stations, until he landed on the soulful sounds of Otis Redding's "These Arms of Mine." Dalton thought that was more like it. The look on the doc's face said she agreed. He left the radio and walked across the room towards her. She backed away from him slowly, playfully, her eyes telling him to come on. He did, taking off his jacket as he crossed the floor. She turned and headed past the bed, away from the kitchen area and towards the corner with the couches and the old fireplace set into the barn's wall, checking over her shoulder to make sure he was following all the time. "So," Dalton said, asking something he'd been wondering about for a while now. "I saw your picture at Red Webster's place." She smiled, as if she was happy he'd spotted her there. "He's my uncle," she told him. "Nice old guy," Dalton said, and meant it. "Yeah," she agreed, a slightly sadder tone to her voice. "He raised me after my parents died. That's why I came back here." She shrugged. "Now we take care of each other." "So, how come you never got married?" Dalton asked hesitantly. He'd learned the hard way that you had to ask this question. "I did," she told him. "What happened?" he asked, hoping that she didn't think he was prying. "Didn't work out," she answered simply. "Why?" he asked, knowing now that he was prying. "Guess I picked the wrong guy," the doc offered, in a tone that said she didn't want to talk about this anymore. Dalton was okay with that. Her backing up had finally taken her to a stop against the exposed brick wall by the fireplace. He gave her a moment, just looking into her eyes, to see if she wanted to move away from him. But instead she stepped into his arms. They swayed together to the music for a while, tentatively running their hands across each other. Dalton reached in for a kiss, but she didn't respond by offering her lips. He wondered if he'd made a mistake, if she wasn't ready. Then she ran her hands down his body to his belt and began to unbuckle it. When that was done, he reached down along the sides of her legs and grabbed the hem of her summer dress, lifting it up and running his nails gently up her thighs as he went. He enjoyed the way she held herself against him, and moaned as he did so. They started to kiss, and it became more passionate, until he reached down and lifted her up into his arms. She wrapped her legs tightly around him as they fell into the wall, the sudden movement adding to the rush. She felt safe in his strong but tender arms as she let him inside her. He enjoyed the touch and taste of her as they kissed and came together, smiling and laughing. They started there at the wall and ended up in the bed, eventually, making love late into the night. When Dalton woke up, the doc was sleeping soundly beside him. It had been a while since he'd woken up next to anyone. It felt strange. He looked down at her, her lips parted slightly and face peaceful above the white cotton sheet, and decided he liked the feeling. Taking care not to wake her, he got up from the bed carefully, grabbed his smokes from his jacket, and headed out through the open window and onto the barn roof beyond. He had a rug already laid out there for nights like this. The moon was high in the sky, and the grey clouds were moving slowly in the gentle June breeze. He lit his cigarette and watched two of the horses chasing and playing with each other in the paddock below, whinnying happily. For the first time in a long time, he felt content. It wasn't long until he heard the doc wake back inside. She followed him out onto the roof, the white sheet wrapped around her just enough to make him want to ask her to take it off again. She didn't say a word, but just sat down beside him. When he looked at her, she leaned in and kissed him on the lips. Then she looked down at a scar on his shoulder, running a finger gently along it. "Little Rock," he told her, remembering the face of the angry man coming at him with the broken bottle. He could laugh about it now, but a shard of glass will kill you just as fast as a knife if it hits you in the right spot. "You're gonna have a lot of pain when you're older, Dalton," the doc warned him, in a voice that was warm rather than admonishing. "You could be crippled if you don't slow down." "Yeah, that's what they say," he agreed, thinking that she wasn't the first doctor he'd spoken to, even if she was the first one he'd sat next to naked. "You know that already?" she asked, wondering why he didn't do something about it if he'd accepted the fact. "No," he replied. "I just said that's what they say." He laughed, and she groaned at his humour, gave him a look that said, "What am I going to do with you?" He didn't know, but he wanted to find out. "Where are you going to go from here?" she asked him, sounding like she knew the sort of life he lived and accepting it as a fact that, sooner or later, he would move on. Dalton took a moment to reply, interested to find out that some part of him wanted her to ask him to stay here. "I don't know," he sighed eventually. "You could stay, Dalton," she said, looking out at the river and avoiding his eyes, scared of the reaction she thought she might see there. "If you wanted to." Now that she had said it, he didn't know how to reply. The doc looked back at him, and he could see a sort of longing reflected in her pretty blue eyes. He didn't want to lie to her, didn't want to hurt her. "I don't think so," he said, deciding that was the best answer he could give right now. He lay back down on the rug, arms folded behind his head. He hoped she didn't press it any further until he'd had more time to think. After a moment, she lay down beside him, resting her head on his arm and sharing the sheet out over the pair of them. After a few silent minutes, she ran her knee up his body and climbed on top of him, seeming to decide that if tonight was all they had, she wanted to make the most of it. Eventually the doc fell back to sleep, but Dalton lay awake for a long time, thinking about her, about another woman from his past, and about what his future might look like. He thought too about what Brad Wesley had said about destiny, and wondered, not for the first time, if such a thing really existed, and how powerful it was. Wesley had never believed that a man needed much sleep. He'd first learned what he was capable of doing on a few short naps a day as a young soldier back in Korea, being woken sporadically to stand guard or get moving. Now, while everyone else was asleep, he was thinking, he was working, he was improving. He was winning. On summer nights like this, he'd sit in his rocking chair out on his bedroom balcony with his imported cigar and a crystal decanter of the finest brandy, just listening to the river below. He found it helped him think. It was a place of calm, a place in which he had total control, or at least the illusion of it. Tonight, that illusion was shattered. He watched the barn roof across the river, where the Dalton boy was laying down with Elizabeth Clay. Once upon a time, he'd had designs on making that woman his wife, back before she'd left town for the first time. She could have been, no, she should have been with Brad Wesley, and now here she was running around with some hired help. No, it just wouldn't do. What to do about this man, Dalton, he wondered. The man who was trying to interfere with Wesley's destiny. Taking out his men, taking his woman, taking his offer and throwing it in his face, taking and taking and taking. It disgusted him. What was he supposed to do? Wait until Dalton had taken his whole town? That wasn't the sort of man that Brad Wesley was, and it was the reason that he had hired help of his own.